Jesus Christ in his ministry, during the days of his public ministry, he faced much oppression. There were people who resented his ministry, and they resented the fact that the multitudes were thronged to him and they loved him. And this caused much despair among the people who were supposed to be the spiritual leaders of the day, but they were failing in their efforts. You see, people don't understand that even when people who supposedly were in authority, when they would preach to the people, there would be something absent. If you remember, we found this in the Gospel of Mark, that after Jesus had called the four, Peter, James, and John, and Andrew, it says, in the early days of the ministry, he took them with him to the synagogue, and Jesus preached. And those men left that meeting going, we've never heard anything like this before. We've never heard of a preacher preach the way this man preached. And it's amazing that a man who would bring such hope to the multitudes could stir such wrath in those who were supposed to understand about spiritual things. As you remember, in the story of Nicodemus that came to Jesus, we find this in the 3rd chapter of John. And he came to Jesus. Most people think that he came to Jesus to ask him how to be born again, but that's not what he came to ask Jesus. He came to ask Jesus about the miracles. He wanted to know, how did you do the miracles? Or how do you do the miracles? And that's when Jesus said, you have to be born again. And even then, Nicodemus didn't understand it. He said, well, you mean I have to go back into my mother's womb and be born again? And then Jesus explained to him, you have to be born of the water and of the Spirit. But what I find to be fascinating in this encounter, down to about verse number 5 of that chapter of John, the 3rd chapter, Jesus says to Nicodemus, he says, here you are, a ruler of the Jews, and you don't know these things? And I think that message could have been given to almost all of them who were spiritually in charge. Sadducees and Pharisees and scribes and these people. They were the ones who were establishing plots to kill him. We find this in the Gospel of John, right after the resurrection of Lazarus. In that same chapter, it talks about they convened a council. It says, we've got to kill him. Much oppression. Jesus faced much oppression and much opposition. I tell you all these things because sometimes people get discouraged in the ministry. There are pastors who probably, right now, there's probably a pastor listening to this broadcast and they're about ready to hang it up because they're facing oppression. Well, I'm going to tell you something. Jesus did too. And aren't we glad that Jesus didn't give up? But he prayed to his Father. And there in the Garden of Gethsemane, we find where God had to dispatch angels to hold him up. But God did. And God is still in that same work. It's Pastor Jack King with the gospel on the radio broadcast.